Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us Across the Fence. I'm Fran Stoddard. On the day to celebrate the life, legacy, and service of the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we're revisiting a recent conversation we had with Vermont's Executive Director of Racial Equity, Xusana Davis. The state created the Office of Racial Equity in 2019. It works with local, state, federal, and nonprofit partners to advance equity in all areas of life in Vermont. My discussion with Ms. Davis began with why the job resonated with her in the first place.
It was a lot of fun following the trajectory of the legislation from where I was at the time. I was in another jurisdiction in a neighboring state, and it signaled, when the legislation passed, it signaled to the rest of the country that Vermont was serious. And I had been living in predominantly Black areas and predominantly white areas for most of my life. And so I always kind of felt like I stood out anyway. So I was, I suppose, ready for a change of scenery after being in the city for just over a decade, and thought that it would be an honor really to help drive that work.
Well, our gain, and you have a law degree from New York Law School. When and why did your interest in law shift from international human rights law to policy and policymaking?
Honestly, it never did. The U.S. is a nation in the world, and it's one of the places where human and civil rights are most often violated. So I really think I'm still doing that kind of work. It feels like it's not, because we have this concept that the U.S. is somehow separate.
Right. Interesting. So in March, you spoke to students at Northern Vermont University Johnson, where you asked the students, what is a Vermonter? And what's your answer to that question?
You know, my answer to that question is someone who's a member of Vermont's community, period. No waiting period, no tenure requirements, residency requirements. If you live and work and study and play and contribute to the Vermont community, you're a Vermonter. It is that simple.
So Vermonters who say, no, you have to be born here or have 3 generations, what is your response to that?
Well, you know, I always laugh and cry internally when I hear people say, well, I'm a native Vermonter. I always say, oh, you're Abenaki? Because the truth is that when we think about who gets to claim ownership over a place or a space, who gets to claim dominion over somewhere, we think about it in zero-sum terms. Right? The fact is that, sure, maybe I wasn't born here, or maybe the last 6 generations of my lineage haven't been born here. But look at the contribution that I or someone else is making to the community. Have we made Vermont a little bit better by being here? If so, why would you begrudge that to somebody? For a sense of superiority? I think we're beyond that. Yeah. I think that if we want to be mature and if we want to acknowledge the demographic challenges that our state is having, we've got to be more open, because you know, our population and birth rate aren't going to rise overnight and just magically, right? We've got to do more to be welcoming.
And it's happening. And so you personally, have you experienced racism in Vermont since you moved up here from New York City?
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
What happened? How did you respond?
You know, every situation is different. And perhaps it's not worth delving into details, because the main thing is that there are a few roles that people play when those things happen. There's the person to whom it's happening. There's the person or persons contributing to it or perpetuating it. And then there are the people around them, the bystanders. And the real point here is not necessarily how the target of the behavior behaves, especially if it's someone who's been dealing with it their entire lives, right? For some of us, there's an autopilot response. What matters really is how the witnesses and the bystanders behave, because that can make or break the teaching moment for the person doing the bigoted thing, right? Whether if you stay silent, if you do nothing, then what that says to the person who's experiencing the bigotry is that you tacitly approve. Now, it might be because you're afraid or you don't know what to do or say. And internally, you know that, but we don't know that. When you stay silent, we think you're just going along with it. So it's really important that if people feel strongly about it, then they should say something.
Be proactive, say something, yeah.
Absolutely.
So, since the tragic death of George Floyd, there seems to be a significant increase in conversations and forums, webinars about race, the Black Lives Matter gatherings and debates and much more in the state. What kinds of shifts are you seeing from this awareness and more focus across the state, if any?
We're definitely seeing shifts. A lot more usage of the language of equity, which is great. It lets me know that people are paying attention. Now, genuine commitment, that's another thing. Sometimes it can be performative, or sometimes it actually undercuts the people we're intending to serve. So I'm seeing a lot more tangible investments in equity, which is really, really great. And we need more of that. And we need more of the undoing. That is to say, it's not just putting new good things into place. It's also about rolling back some of the historic policies or behaviors that have engendered discrimination.
Okay, and then there's also, of course, the backlash that has been happening for some, which is dangerous and very troubling. So how do we do that? How do we work at these things that you say might undercut your efforts? How do we collectively continue productive conversations in Vermont?
Well, I always tell people there's a step one, but before that, there's a step zero. And step zero is lower your guard and open your eyes. Stop being defensive about it. Know the difference between what's false versus what's just uncomfortable. Because people, equity practitioners, people rarely challenge us on the historical or present day facts of the matter. It's usually just that it hurts their feelings to hear it said out loud, or that they just don't like people knowing and discussing these awful truths. And I get that. That must be quite uncomfortable. But imagine the pain that oppressed groups feel actually having had to go through it and then stifle it to spare someone else's feelings. So my first suggestion is you've got to get rid of the defensiveness, right? I'm not necessarily personally attacking you as an individual if I acknowledge that one of the founders did some bad things. And being able to make that separation and acknowledge there's an ugly history here. It's not going away. And it doesn't matter how many books you burn. That doesn't make it less true. Instead, how do we take what we know and do better going forward? That's going to be a real reflection of who we are as people, not the actions of people in the past.
Great. And so where do you see the greatest need for equity work for the most productive benefit? I mean, at home, at church, at work, in our communities, in town government, in our schools, all these places, we need to have these conversations and do this work. But where do you see really the greatest need for equity?
In all those places, really in every place where inequity has been embedded, that's where the greatest need is. So we're thinking housing sector, education, right? Academic outcomes are extremely disparate. So are discipline outcomes. We know that employment and income, lending and home financing. I mean, pretty much every sector has had inequity built into it. And so every sector is where we've got to do the work. And it's hard to prioritize because so much of it is intertwined. For example, where you live and how you live is directly tied to your educational outcomes. And your educational outcomes are directly tied to your employment attainment. And your employment is inextricably linked to, again, where and how you live. So it's very much cyclical.
And you were formerly involved in with the health department in New York and how health affects everything, and housing, how housing affects health, et cetera. So I know that you're looking into some of these very difficult places, but your work not only is really helping people of color, but really all Vermonters in a way. You're looking at systemically how this works for everyone.
And that is the key that a lot of people miss, which is equity work genuinely benefits everybody. I mean, there are so many rights and privileges that Americans enjoy today that were won on the backs of people in the civil rights era or other marginalized groups seeking freedom from oppression. And once people recognize that the gains made by any marginalized group in this country always benefit members of dominant groups in this country, they should realize how silly it is to oppose that kind of progress when in the end, they're probably going to benefit from it anyway.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about doing the work. What are actions or even one action that an individual can do today that can move the needle a little bit more towards an equitable, welcoming state?
I suppose one good step is to watch programs like these and just be exposed to different ideas. Another good stop to make is to go to the Racial Equity Office's website and look at our Action and Allyship Guide. That's racialequity.vermont.gov. The Action and Allyship Guide has a list of suggested media that you can learn more from and a number of ideas that you can use to get involved. Some of those include things like stop needlessly calling the police. You are weaponizing the state against people. Handle your problems. Stop making assumptions about people's spending habits or credentials, motivations, family structure, etc. You don't know us. So if I go to a store in Vermont and get followed around like I often do, why is that? Is it because you presume that I'm going to be shoplifting? Is it because you presume that I can't afford what's in the store? Right? So stop making assumptions and relying on tired tropes and stereotypes about people. Stop excusing the unjust behavior of people around you. Again, there are lots of people who would hear this message from me and not be moved, but would hear the same message from one of their own peers and really stop and think. So if you're somebody who genuinely understands how injustice is showing up in the people around you, tell them so.
Right. So we as white people have a lot of work to do ourselves and among ourselves. So what do you want viewers to know about you that we might have missed today?
That's a tough one because believe it or not, I'm actually kind of a private person. I don't know. I suppose I would say I appreciate all the support that people have shown me around the state. And yet it's not about me. I hope that people are directing their support to the people of color in their communities because I see myself in them and you should too. So, don't praise me and then turn around and mistreat others who are just like me because that could be me. There's not much difference sometimes. So that I think tells me everything about people's sincerity.
Xusana Davis, thank you so much for being with us today. Xusana Davis is Vermont's Executive Director of Racial Equity. Thank you so much, and we are so thrilled that you will be with us tomorrow afternoon. We want to let viewers know that you've agreed to be back and to talk specifically more about your work, about racism and diversity in our state government. I look forward to speaking with you again. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for joining us across the fence. I'm Fran Stoddard. Stay well.